Yeah. So yeah. So what are your names?
We're nice.
What are your names?
My name is Jordan.
Jordan. Cool. And
Garrett.
Garrett. Okay. Jordan and Garrett.
Nice meeting you.
In the class.
Yeah.
You know, it would be easier if we clapped for everyone at the end, right?
Yeah. Cool.
I'm just saying, they're listening.
Alright, so welcome to Intro to Angular. So this talks specifically about rendering components. A while ago someone asked me, like, if I want to get started on a front-end framework or technology, how should I start? And I was thinking about that, and then I told him that, like, just keep it simple, keep it easy, just learn how to render components, and that's how you start, like, and then worry about the logic. So first render components, and then worry about the logic. So in this talk, we're just gonna learn about rendering components in Angular. So by the end of this talk, I'm confident that you guys will learn how to at least render components onto a site. So what is Angular? How many of you guys have heard about Angular before? Cool, awesome, a good amount. Okay, so Angular is a front-end framework used to build a single-page application. So you guys are familiar with the term SPA, single-page application?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, can someone tell me what a single-page application is? Like, what's so special about a single-page application?
It's a page that just fetch information from the server and puts it on the page without reloading the page, and you don't need to navigate to another page to load content.
Yes, exactly. Well said. What's your name?
Ricardo.
Ricardo. Thank you, Ricardo. So as Ricardo said, so a single-page application is just like one document, and the beauty about a single-page application is it minimizes call to the server. So I don't know if you guys ever took like an intro to like web class, but they usually teach you how to make like a couple of HTML documents, link them all together, and then you have to build so many documents for each link to go to. But with a single-page application, it uses like one HTML document, and anything that changes within that document is changed using JavaScript typically. Right. So Angular was made by Google, and Angular is great for large projects from multiple contributors, and it uses something called TypeScript. So how many of you guys have heard about TypeScript?
Heard about it?
Yeah. How many of you guys used it? Cool. All right. I'll get a little bit into it later on. And for this talk, we're going to be using Angular 8. So that's the latest Angular that's out there. All right. So there's sometimes a bit of confusion when learning Angular. There's AngularJS, Angular 2, and right now we're using Angular 8. So in 2010, AngularJS, also known as Angular 1, was released. At that time, there was like a lot of changes with JavaScript, and then like React was coming out, and then there's like new paradigms to creating web applications. So because of that, they decided to rewrite Angular all over again and call it Angular 2. So in 2016, Angular 2 was released. So Angular 2 is almost completely different from AngularJS. So to create new versions of Angular 2, about every 6 months, a new version of Angular 2 was released. So it went from Angular 2, Angular 3 was skipped, and then it went to Angular 4, 5, 6, 7, and today we have Angular 8. So just last year, in 2019, Angular 8 was released. And so just to get the terminology correct, so when people talk about Angular, they usually refer to Angular 2. And when people talk about AngularJS, it's just like AngularJS or Angular 1. So you could use, like, when you go on the internet and you look up tutorials on Angular, you could use Angular 2 tutorials, even though they're a bit outdated, for learning Angular 8. But of course it's a bit outdated, but that's, you can use those tutorials. All right, cool. So a little bit about TypeScript. TypeScript is an addition to JavaScript. It gives, like JavaScript, I would say like additional functionality. and it allows you to type your variables, preventing the dynamic typing that JavaScript is known for. So when I say type your variables, do you guys know what that means? That term, that saying, typing your variables.
Is that like when you specify that certain data is a string, if something else is passed to it, it's gonna give you an error?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I like giving the example of like like Pokemon, right? Everyone knows about Pokemon, right? And each Pokemon has who's familiar with Pokemon? Okay, cool. Alright, each Pokemon has their type, right? So you got like a Pokemon that's like grass type and fire and all those other ones. So it's the same thing with variables. So if you have a variable called like dog, right? You would assign a type to that. So that type, you can make it into a string, or you can make it into a different type, a type of like number in TypeScript. So the beauty about this TypeScript is it checks the type at the time you write your code. So let's say you're using a method and you want to pass in an argument into that method, and you're passing in a string. Your editor will give you an error saying, no, you can't use a string. This method accepts a number type. So instead of like adding it in and then running it and then seeing all these errors and like trying to find out what happens, doing a bunch of console logs, you could just see what the error is at the time you code. Cool. So, so TypeScript compiles to JavaScript, and it's very useful for large applications with multiple contributors. So, of course, it's like if you have other people creating code, and then you're using their code to like add on to your code, you would like to like know what arguments you're passing in, what arguments you need, the type of those arguments. So that will prevent prevents errors, and it makes development a lot quicker. Any questions so far? Cool. So for this talk, we're gonna be using the Node, and we're gonna have to download Node and the Angular CLI. I mentioned on the Slack to download the Angular CLI ahead of time. Is there anyone like following along with this talk? It's okay if you're small, but I'm just wondering. Okay. How many of you guys are using StackBlitz? Okay, cool. All right. If you guys ever need me to slow down, let me know. Or if there's some confusion, let's like raise your hand. I'll try to help you out. And if someone knows like the answer, feel free to help them out. Cool. So let's start coding.
So before you start, by any chance, is there any way you can put the link or like drop the presentation into Slack?
Oh, like right now? Or like at the end? I'll do it at the end.
Okay,
Is that cool?
that's fine.
Cool. Yeah. So, okay. So, for those using the Angular CLI, go to your terminal and type in ng new my app. So this is gonna create a project, and that project is gonna be called my app. For those using StackBlitz, just click where it says like new Angular, there's a button that says Angular, and you click on it, and that'll generate a new Angular project. So you hit enter.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, can you enlarge
yes.
like
All right.
thank you.
One more. I think that's good. Okay, cool. This
More.
more.
We're blind, dude.
Okay,
Beautiful.
you guys see that? Yeah, all the way in the back. Yes. Barely. Ah. Okay, one more.
It's fine.
All right, cool. So when you run this Angular command, it asks, would you like to add Angular routing? For the purposes of this talk, we'll say no. And then which style sheet format would you like to use? And we're gonna use CSS. So yeah, so Angular is doing its thing. In the meantime, I will internet's a bit slow. Alright. So right now, Angular is doing its thing. It's done. So when you do this at home, it doesn't take this long. It usually goes pretty quick.
I know, well, and everybody's connected too, so
Yeah,
this internet's
so
not
we're all
good
doing
and
it.
it's.
We have really slow internet here.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no worries.
Here's one.
Cool. Alright. How many of you guys are still running? Okay, cool. We'll wait a couple more minutes.
I was trying to show you earlier. So basically, I have to pass it into this one. And I need to pull up to the reference. Well, I guess you can value from two areas. The second one, there's
Are you guys done? Or is it slow?
Actually have an error.
Oh yeah? You're gonna get some errors.
Yeah, package install failed. See above here.
What?
Oh, no.
Package install failed? Did you also install Node? With your...
This is true, and just put that value to
If you guys got any errors, like if it's not working, then
I said I
go
go to the
on,
online one.
yeah, go on Stack Blitz. You go there by going stackblitz.com and clicking the Angular button. So, let me just be...
Same thing, but put in like a new one. Here, or if I wanted to do.
So I'm going to continue. So when your Angular project is created, just CD into your project. So now you're in your project, and you could open it in Visual Studio Code.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're here, go to your source, src, click app, and then leave it right there. And then open your terminal.
All right, people.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
You're gonna have to talk louder so
Yeah, it's
other
really
people can
slow
hear
right
you in the
now.
back.
Okay, cool. So we have on our Angular app, we have a terminal open, and right here you should still be on this page on StackBlitz. So on our Angular, on our terminal, we type in ngserve, and that would run our Angular application. So for StackBlitz, you don't need to do that. It's already running.
Also, if there's people that are getting errors really good and trying to install packages, it might be
Yeah.
because of the connection too.
Yeah.
Could be
Okay.
stalling out.
Yeah, then
Okay. Cool. So when you run this, notice that it says it's running on localhost 4200. So
Does Angular always use 40?
yeah, it always by default goes to localhost 4200.
Okay.
So if you go to localhost 4200, your Angular app should appear. So this is what you get when you run ngserve. So there's other ways to run ngserve. So for your terminal, do Control-C to stop it, and then if you don't want it to run on 4200, and let's say port 3000, you could do ngserve and do -- port 3000. Cool. So now we see it that it's on localhost 3000. So just to verify that,
One quick question.
yes.
So when I ran the ngserve, I got an error. It said could not find module Angular get view Angular.
Like it might be the internet connection. Try going on StackBlitz instead. I'll look at it at the end of class. Cool.
We usually run it on top 42 or?
It's just because some of the dependencies was
Okay.
not able to get it.
So go to app.component.html, and you see all this here. Delete everything, and then hit save. So when it's done saving, notice that everything is gone. Okay, so this is what we wanted. And if you're in Stack Blitz, go to that same file. And just delete everything, save it. Okay, cool. So, in your app.component.html, have a hello world. And then when you hit save, it refreshes, and you have your hello world, right? So then, how do we get this hello world help here? What happens? What does Angular do to have this hello world, like, on the browser? So, the first thing that Angular looks at is main.ts. So see this main.ts. So TS stands for TypeScript. So we're using TypeScript in Angular. And look at this bootstrap module, app.module. So it's saying that app.module is in app.module. So where is that located? It's located here. So Angular looks at main.ts, then it looks in here at app.module, and goes in here, and it looks at all this, right? Okay, the next thing Angular looks at is this bootstrap, and looks for app.component. And app.component is in app, is a app.component.ts file. The ts is omitted. So we're right here, and we're looking for app.component.ts, and it's right over here. So this is your Angular component. So we see import, we see this component, this is a decorator, I'll talk about that later. And then I want you guys to focus on this selector. So do you guys know about CSS selectors? Okay, so what's a CSS selector? Yeah.
Like an ID or a class to specify what you are.
Yeah. So they include like tags, like an H1 tag, P tag. They include classes, and they also include like IDs, right? So it's saying to put whatever's in HTML in the app.component HTML and use this selector. But where is this selector located? This selector is located actually in the index.html file. So you see app.root. So this is our selector right here. So this app.component.ts is using the selector to put in anything related to this component, which includes this template and this style, into index.html. It looks for app-root and injects that logic in there. Any questions about that? Clear? All right, cool. So now we're gonna manually create a component. So create a new file, and let's call this component, say 1. First. So we're gonna just create the folder for it. If you're following along Stack Blitz, it's the same thing.
You're going to create it adjacent to the app folder or inside?
What?
Are you putting the folder adjacent to app or inside?
I'm creating a folder called first, and I'm gonna put like the component files into that
It's
folder.
inside app.
Oh, it's inside app, yeah. So inside first, we're gonna create 3 files. So the first file is gonna be called first.component.ts. And then we're gonna have first.component.html. And then we're gonna have first.component.css. So right now these are all blank. So we need to make this an Angular component. We need to make Angular recognize this as an Angular component. So we go to our first .component.ts and we import component from Angular core. So this imports a decorator so that Angular can recognize this as an Angular component. So to use the decorator, we need the @ sign, and then we have the component. And then we need 3 things. We need a selector. We need a template URL, and then we need styles URLs. So let's call our selector at first. And our template, so what's our template going to be?
First.component.html.
Awesome, thank you. So we put where it's located. I like putting the /. First dot component dot HTML. And then for styles URLs, it has to be an array of strings, right? So the style sheet that we use is first dot component first dot component dot CSS. Cool. So this is a JavaScript decorator. So any of you guys use JavaScript decorators?
Use my Python.
Cool. So what's a decorator? So can you tell me what a decorator is? Kind of just of a decorator.
It reaches back to the core and it has like pre-written kind of method
Yeah.
instruction.
Yeah,
Okay.
instructions, right? Okay, so I like to give the example of like a fir tree and a Christmas tree, right?
Yeah.
So what makes a fir tree different from a Christmas tree?
Okay.
What makes it different? Like
One's decorated.
one's decorated, one's not, right? When you have a different, or when you have a Christmas tree and you decorate it, it gives it like additional functionality, additional
Right.
like additional stuff to
So
it,
I've
right?
used it like to require that it be a post, that no other like calls can be done. So it's
Yeah.
At required posts.
Yeah. So you could tell, it tells you what a decorator is in Angular. So a decorator that marks a class as an Angular component and provides configuration metadata that determines how the component should be processed, instantiated, and used at runtime. So
That's much clearer than.
yeah. So what's really good about
I thought it was sarcastic.
this is like you could hover over stuff and it tells you what it is. Right? And this decorator has to precede the class of our component. So after we write the decorator, we type in export class, and then we're gonna call this first component. And there you go. Save it. Wait, let's find this one. Oh, I made a typo. Style URLs. Okay, cool. All right, so we need our template now. So in our template, we're going to create h1 tag, and we're going to call this first component. Great. For now, we're not going to add any styles to it. So you got our first component HTML, first component.ts, and now, how do we add this component to our document? Anyone know? Does anyone have an idea?
And you put it in the app component, right?
Yeah. So we would put it here in app component.html. So how do we put this component in app.component.html? We would use the selector.
Oh, so it'd be a tag after
Yes.
post tag. Got it.
Exactly. So what's the name of our tag? At first.
Hold on, can you go back to the,
Yes. So I'm gonna go back to first component.ts. Yeah, it's probably style zeros.
no, I did that one right.
Oh, maybe the comma.
I'm getting an error on the first, on the export part.
So another thing I want to add is this @ sign is different from this @ sign. This @ sign indicates that this is a decorator, and this @ sign is for node modules. It indicates like a group of related packages or it's not, a group of related modules.
I'm sorry, can you make the font a little bit bigger, please?
Yes. There you go. One more.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So I'll continue. So let's go to our document, and it's saying, well, there's nothing there, right? It's saying there is an error. There's one other step we need to do to make Angular recognize this as an Angular component. Where you have to go is into your app.module.ts and add it into this configuration. So we have to add it in declarations right here. So this tells it anything related to that in app.component, use these modules. So of course app.component, we're using the app component module or component. And we also need to use first component. And we also have to import it. So we added it into our declarations and we imported it inside our app.module.ts. And we go back. It's there. We got hello world and we got first component. Any questions so far on how that works? Cool. All right.
So when you named it first component, is that just your choice of names, or is it you just combine?
This right here, this naming convention.
Wait, because you know in was it Pascal case instead of my first dot? I'm just curious.
Oh, this was my choice. So this could have been anything. Just
Oh,
convention.
I didn't see where you were.
Oh yeah,
I'm
sorry.
I didn't
So,
see where you declared it.
My
sorry.
bad. So
My oversight.
okay. So in first.component.ts, we export this class, right? First component, right? So that other files could see it whenever they import it. So in our app.module.ts, we're going to first, on first.component right here, remember the .ts is omitted, and we're importing first component. And we're adding it here in our declarations. Good question.
I got it. I just missed where you.
No problem. It's good. I bet other people have that question.
Oh, it's just going. It's in
Okay,
all the way.
Cool. Okay. So next,
One quick question. Why
Yes.
.ts was omitted? Even by default, if we don't put .ts, it will recognize as .ts. So if it's another extension, then we need to specify it.
if it's not in the, oh, are you talking about
the
right here?
the first component .ts.
So I think you could put .ts.
You can't. But so his question is, if there was a different component, like let's say it was a .css, then you would need to put that on there.
I don't think
there?
Well, I never loaded
It's
CSS.
like JavaScript
Like,
and
or
it's
is it-
not
is it-
JS.
Oh, in general for importing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I know there's some like cases where you have to put in the what's it called the suffix.
extension.
The extension. And other cases you don't have to. It just depends on what environment you're working in. Cool. Good question. All right. So, in first.component.ts, I'm gonna show you different ways to create a selector. So there's 3 types of selectors. Right now, we're using the it's called the element selector. There's also an attribute selector, and there's also what's the other one? A class selector. So right here we're using an element selector, but you could also use an attribute selector. So are you guys familiar with attributes in HTML? Like what's an attribute in HTML?
It's like for instance when you have a button, you can set an attribute of value or name.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, so HTML has it has its own depending on the DOM element, it has its own like built-in attributes, but you can also add attributes to it. So in our first component, so let's say we want to use the attribute selector. Save it. You're gonna get an error because it doesn't recognize this. It doesn't. If you go to your HTML, we're not using. If we go into app.module.html, app.component.html, we're not using an attribute selector. We're using an element selector. So let's comment that out, and let's create a div. And our attribute is going to be called what? It's going to be called app-first. So that's an attribute for this div. So when you save that, loads it, and it's working again. So that's another type of selector you can use. The third type of selector is the class selector. So do you guys know what classes are in web development? Yes?
It's a way to specify which element you're working with.
Yeah, it's like in CSS, you use classes to specify like where you want your CSS. So instead of brackets, to use a class selector, we just use a dot. And we go back to our app.component.html, and instead of our attribute, we're going to create a div with a class. We go to app first. Save it. And it works. Cool. All right. Any questions on selectors? All right.
Can you go back?
Yeah.
Go back
Up to
to where you created.
this.
Yes, this right
Yeah.
there.
Actually, the other selector. I'm gonna type these out and I'm gonna comment it out, just so you guys can see. Okay.
So I have a question. So
Yeah.
basically the selector is like the keyword, say how you would be calling the like the component to the website.
Yeah, you can see that. It's calling, but kind of like injecting, where it wants this functionality to be injected, this logic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Cool. So now that we're done with selectors, we're gonna go into template URL. So we're using first.component.html as our template. But there is another way to say what you want to be as your template, and it's just template. And let's make this into, so you could write your HTML within the quotes. So instead of a H1, let's do a H2. And let's call it another first. Within our comma. So instead of using the HTML, first.component HTML as our template, it's going to use this within the quotes as our template. So if you go here, we have another first. Cool. But I cannot do multi-lines on this. Let's do like, it gets tricky. So, okay, so if I do this, it gets tripped up. So instead of doing single or double quotes, I need to use backticks. And then it'll recognize it as a template. So, save this here. It appears right here. So those are 2 ways to create a template, or that's 3 ways. Template URL, template with quotes, and template with backticks. So now with style URLs, there's also another way. Instead of using style URLs, you would use just styles. And styles accepts an array. And in that array, you type in the string. So for styles, let's what do we have here? We got a H2, right? Let's give H2 a color of red. So we save that and go to our application. We have this to be red, right? And I didn't mention about first.component.css. If we go to our style sheet, we can make style changes here also. See that?
I think you imported your.
Yeah, I didn't import it. Yeah, so going back to here. Oh wait, I'm not using an H1. So okay, in this template, I'm using an H2 and an H3, so I don't have an H1. So I have to change this. I can make it into H3. And then it's blue. Okay, and for this one, of course, if you have multi-lines, you could also use backticks. Okay, any questions with styling components? Cool. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about how to generate components. So we've seen how to generate it manually. I wanted to start with generating components manually because Angular has a way to do it, and just with a command line. But if you don't know what it does, then when you create the component, you're not going to be familiar with how to delete the component. Yeah, you build the component, but you don't know how to delete the component. So let's actually delete this component. So what do I have to do to delete this component? I could delete this entire folder, right? So I'm going to delete this entire folder. And then what else do I have to delete?
That module needs to have it taken out.
Yes.
That is a component.
Where is it? At module.ts, right? This is gone. And this is gone. Delete the comma. Save. And we'll go back. So what do we expect to see on our page?
Nothing.
We see just the hello world. We still have that hello world
Right.
that's built in. Yeah. Cool. So we know how to create a component manually. we know how to delete a component. Now I'm going to show you guys how to create a component using the Angular CLI. So I'm going to create another terminal here. So my server's still running. So we create a component using this Angular CLI using ng generate component, and let's call this component. Let's call it first again. Call it something else. Oh, you know what? I need to. Okay, I might have to restart my server after I delete component that has the same name.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So I create a second component right here, and I call it second. And notice it creates all of the same files. And in addition, it creates this spec.ts file. So this spec.ts file is used for testing. So we're not going to go over that in this talk, but just be aware that's what that file is used for. And in addition, if we go to our app.module.ts, we see it imported here, and we see it added here. So that's what happens when you use ng generate component. It creates the folder with the files, and it adds it into your app.module.ts. So now that we know how to delete a component, you could easily know, like, I have to delete this, I have to delete this, and I could delete the folder, and your component will be gone. So well, there's a shorter way to generate component. Instead of ng generate component, you can just do ng generate gc. Let's call this one third. That also creates a component. And in most cases, you won't need to, this one creates another component. Bless you. And in app.module.ts, we see the component here also. So a lot of times we don't need this spec file. And so we could go ng gc spec equals false.
You didn't name it.
Oh shoot, thank you. Yes. What name would you like to use for the component? Let's call this fourth. That's what's good about the CLI. It corrects you.
Did you mean?
Did you mean? Yeah. Cool. So we see our fourth component here, and notice that there's no spec file.
Right.
Cool. And if we want to nest components within components, or not necessarily, if we want to put a component inside another component, like nest them, you could do generate component. We type in where we want it. Let's put it in second, and let's call this component, and we do spec equals false, dash spec equals false. And let's call this, oh wait, it needs to go in the fourth. Okay. It's not deleting. And we generate components, or spec equals false. I want it in fourth. And I'm gonna call this one fifth. Cool. So it added into our app.module.ts. And if we go in fourth, we have our fifth inside here. Cool. So in our fifth works if we want to. So if we want to nest components, we would have to specify where we want our component to be at. So right now, fourth.html has fourth works. But let's say we want object, save it. It's not gonna show because we didn't add it onto our app.component.html. So if we go to our app.component.html, let's do element selector at fourth, and if we save it here, we should see fourth works and fifth works. And there we have it. It's kind of small. Cool. All right. Any questions about that? About how to render components? Yeah.
So what exactly is like a component?
So a component, in the terms of Angular, it's just how it's the display, the view, and also the data associated with that view. It's like both the view and the logic in Angular. I mean, that's the gist of what a component is. Yeah, good question.
So far, we haven't seen any.
We haven't seen any logic because this writes like on its own is a bit confusing,
Yeah.
especially how to delete a component because a lot of
Admit it, how
tutorials
many
they
hours did you lose?
yeah, a lot of tutorials they teach you how to create a component. It's like, okay, I want to get rid of this component. And you're like, how do I do that? Like,
Get errors all over.
yeah. So like, I had to go look and do some research on how to delete a component completely because you could delete the folder, but then it's still in your app.module.ts and it's like, oh, I can't find this file. I was like, what are you talking about? I deleted everything associated with that component. It's like, oh wait, it's still being referenced here. So
What are the advantages of using components?
what a
What are
component
the advantages?
Oh.
Advantage of using components
in Angular or in
Angular?
Angular. So the advantage of components is that everything's in one like
Like
location.
centralized.
Yeah,
like
it's centralized, and then you can use those components elsewhere. So like if I have a button component, if I created a button with this, then if I want to replicate, if I want that component to appear somewhere else, all I have to do is add that selector somewhere else, and then that button will appear. Yeah.
So in this case, for example, if we have just the component in centralized location, if we want to make any modification, we can just come into that place and it will be updated onto the website.
Yes, I'll give you an example of that. So I have my app fourth component, right? And let's say I want to make more of it, right? Let's say I have all of those. So we're expecting it to have. Takes a while. Okay, so we're expecting all this to be here, right? So let's say I want to change how this component appears. So let's say now I want to make it red. So I will go to this right here. It's using CSS, right? And in our HTML, it's the P tag, right? So I go to my fourth component. I go to the P tag selector, and I color this big. What's your favorite color?
Black or blue, any color.
Okay,
Blue.
any color?
Okay,
Blue.
blue.
Blue. And then I get blue. I save it. And then I go right here. And everything with the P tag that's associated with the fourth component whatever is blue. Yeah.
So basically, it's the same principle as object-oriented programming. Like a component is like a class, and you can use it like anywhere in your project.
Yes, I would say the difference between like object-oriented programming, that's more like the logic of it, whereas a component includes like the view of it. Like you've seen that we had to create a template, and
Yeah.
we could mess around with the CSS and the HTML of it. But the principle is still the same. You want things to be encapsulated so it can be reusable in other parts of your code.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Along the lines of that logic, how extensible are these components?
What do you mean by extensible?
so you make a component button, right?
Yeah.
I wanna use that same component, but instead of going in and changing the logic from, red text to blue, I want to extend that, and then my component that I made now has a blue one, or, you know, I don't know, drops down at a different rate or whatever.
It should be extendable, because, I mean, it's JavaScript. We can
Well, right,
extend-
but I mean, extendable doesn't mean taking that code, copying it, and pasting it somewhere else.
Yeah.
Is there some form of extendability where you say this component with these attributes?
I'm sure there is. I haven't messed around with that, but
I mean, if you're just changing CSS, you would just add a different class
yeah, if
to
it's
that
with
particular
styling, different class. If it's with like logic functionality,
logic, then that would get a little bit.
yeah, you could extend it. I mean, same with like it's JavaScript. You could extend the classes to add
Right.
additional functionality.
So without liking Angular at all, I can tell you that these components are extendable as you as a developer make them, right?
Yeah.
If you make it to where it's just a black box and that's all you get.
Yeah.
So it's like the same thing in React, right?
Yeah.
You're gonna distribute components, you allow for them to be extendable, like
Yeah.
he's asking, so.
Like, how many of you guys have experience with React? So with Angular, it's like the logic is pretty much the same. There's differences to it. Of course, Angular has two-way binding. Angular includes a lot more. It's made for more like enterprise level architecture. But like basic, extensive, you could extend it. The like functionalities, very like similar. The concept is similar. Yeah.
So your components can have props, or you can pass them data
Yes.
that alter
Yes.
the functionality of the component,
Yes.
similar to any front end framework.
Yes. Yes. So
I don't know if they're called props, but yeah.
yes. So they have some. I guess. I mean, you could pass data from parent to child component. Same way with React. You don't. It's not called props, but it has its own thing, its own way of dealing with data.
We're learning that next week, right?
It's data binding, so it's a bit of that. Yeah. So we get more into the logic next week. Cool. You guys have any other questions? Any comments? Cool. So this was
So when you say like enterprise level building, like what enterprises use it?
so like I know Google uses Angular, so because they created it. By enterprise level, I mean like big companies, right? So like right here, you know how we hovered over where we hovered over this, right? And it tells you what it is, right? So I won't have to guess, okay, what's this do? I could just read it. That's part of like I think TypeScript maybe. But I know, let's say this is getting a little bit into the data. So let's say I have a variable called num, and it's a type of number, and initially set to 0, right? So if I hover over number, so it tells me what it is, and yeah. So if I want to use it, I don't want to filter it next time, but if I want to use it somewhere else, let's say do method test. I go to this dot number, and I set it to, I don't know, dog. It's gonna give me an error and say property number does not exist on this type, or property number. Whoops, no. Then it gives you an error. This dog is not assignable to the type number, right? But if I change it to 3, then it's okay, right? So let's say you're working on code, I'm working on code. I need to use like I need to import, like we've gotten a little bit into imports. Let's say I want to import your code, and I want to like pass something to it, right? Or like just pass something into it, and it's gonna give me that error. It's like, oh, you cannot pass this, or you cannot use this variable because it's not the correct type. So that's a little bit of what makes it more of an enterprise type of framework, is because like
It has
I
safety
could never
nets.
meet you.
It's like strict.
Yeah, it's strict. Like I could never meet you. I could do a bunch of console logs to find out what it does. I know in my work, if I have problems with a bit of code, What's this do? Yeah. But this like limits like it makes it more modular, so you can work on your thing. I can work on my thing. If I need to use your code, I know like there's documentation kind of built in to know what it does. Right. Yeah. I hope that answered your question. Okay, cool. So this talk was very basic. There's a lot to Angular. I know it's I just delved into rendering components because I know when people start and they look at all these files, like, oh, there's so many files. What do all these files do? How do I even create a component? And then they go to a tutorial. It's like, oh, I do ng generate component, and then they create a component, and then they're like, okay, how to delete this component? It's like, oh, they don't tell me. I have to like look that up. And then I thought, you delete the component. Like, wait, I didn't delete everything. So I want to get into. I got into a little bit of how like everything's how the components are connected, how Angular reads the components, how Angular detects them as components, as Angular components. So yeah, so cool. So feel free to go home, build yourself like just an Angular component, really basic, and have fun. Right? Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you guys.